Good day, everyone. We are from Group 11, and we are here today to discuss another philosophical analysis from Andresito Acuna, mainly Unit 5, Module 1 to 3, the analysis of ethical theories. We hope you are doing well and sound as you are about to discover another great topic in our philosophy class. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the class. Let's begin our lesson with Module 1, Types of Ethical Theory. So firstly, we must know what makes a theory ethical. And here we have the three fundamental elements that complete ethical theory. First, it must provide a definition of good and its opposite bad. Second, it must provide a definition of what is right in terms of the good. And third, it must provide a statement of the moral principle in clear and certain terms. Here, it helps us to take into account what we should see in an ethical theory. We are able to discover their definition and what makes it different to know what is good to bad and what is right in making things good. In normative ethics, we have two basic distinctions, the statement of value and statement of obligation. So let's go first with the statement of value. Here, you need to remember the word good. It is the philosopher's concept of what is said to be good. It estimates the worth or value of something like an act, person, object, event, and many more. It usually takes the form of an evaluative statement. X is good, right, correct, just, etc. On the other hand, statement of obligation, from the word itself, it's something that pertains to what we ought to do, our duty and obligation. They take two forms of statement, the prescriptive and the prescriptive. Prescriptive statement simply implies the saying you ought to do Y, while prescriptive statement says don't do X. It is said that the best example of prescriptive statements is the Ten Commandments, a moral code that is systematic prescription and get a formal support to the religious customs and traditional people for the long run. With the help of statement of value and statement of obligation, makikita natin na kapag nag-share ang mga tao ng same form of life and language game, they will likely judge the worth and value of something in the same way. However, kung makaki-interact tayo ng tao na nagtatry or nagpa-practice na ma-accept yung same code of morality na meron tayo, mag-add up yun sa pagpapatibay ng public approval or intersubjective consensus natin. Now, in the moral concept of good, we also have two distinctions, the intrinsic and the instrumental. Intrinsic good directly point out that something is done for their own benefit, and it is not something that are meant for others' end. For example, Aristotle believes that happiness is only intrinsic good we have. He believes that it is the summum bonum, which is the happiness for him is something final and self-sufficient and is the end of the action. We have a lot of things to consider as intrinsic good, just like a comfortable life, world of beauty, self-respect, the feeling of accomplishment, freedom, growth of potential, and many more. All of these will benefit your own good. On the other hand, instrumental good, these are the things used as means for attaining some other good, presumably the intrinsic good. Example of these are being capable, imaginative, logical, responsible, etc. There is no consensus among moral philosophers regarding the kind of things that are considered intrinsic good or instrumental good. And let's keep in mind that the given samples earlier are not fixed and sometimes can be interchanged depending on the orientation of philosophers. Now we have two types of ethical system and can be distinguished with respect to our previous concept, which is the intrinsic good. They are named monist and pluralist. Monist argues that there is only one thing we consider to be intrinsically good, and that is the best example is hedonism. For instance, Jeremy Bentham argued that only pleasure is intrinsically good. There is only one kind of pleasure and its quality is unimportant. But then there's Epicurus and J.S. Mill, who attempted to differentiate qualities of pleasure in terms of physical, intellectual, and spiritual, believing that there are higher forms of pleasure. For Mill, it is not the quantity of bodily pleasure that is significant, but the quality. For him, intellectual pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Next, pluralist believes that there is more than one intrinsic good. They are non-hedonists. For example, Plato, he believes that good life is equivalent to mixed life. It is a mixture of balanced elements that makes necessary good to us. For W.D. Roth, there are four things that are intrinsically good. It is the virtuous disposition, knowledge, pleasure, and just a proportion of pleasure to the virtues. Now, since we already know what is good, it's time for us to discover what is right. The moral obligation falls into two camps, the ontologists and the teleologists. The ontologists, you will judge the rightness of an act by considering the act alone. The presence of consequences are not valuable in this category. There is no provision for exemptions or overriding conditions. As long as you obey them, it is claimed that your action is right. The nature of act alone will determine whether it is right or not. For teleologists, they are unable to decide if one act is right or wrong by the sense of the act itself, meaning the act should be judged and evaluated in terms of its consequences, maximizing the intrinsic good. Here, it is a matter of considering right by its action itself or evaluating its consequences for the good. Now, theologists subdivided the issue of the beneficiary of right actions. There are two versions of theologies, egoism and utilitarianism. For egoism, it questions what action will maximize the greatest good for me. The beneficiary or recipient of the act is the moral agent himself. It is a good for oneself is right. In Plato's version, he states that each person ought to do what will further his self-interest. Its moral principle is self-direct. Enlightened egoism is a version of egoism when you are enjoined to do an act that will benefit another person because you expect that person to do the same for you. It's like a reciprocity type of egoism. Here, helping other people is calculated to promote one's self-interest. On the other side, utilitarianism questions what will maximize the good for the greatest number. This is something that connects to a wide number of beneficiaries as its moral principle is other directed. Here, there are classification of the beneficiary of the good basing on its act. There are two, limited and universal utilitarianism. These two has differences when it comes to the scope of affected people of the action. Limited utilitarianism benefits only a sector of the population, interest group, or a class, and if in the process it makes the other sectors worse. Some of its proponents are society, family, association, NGOs, religious groups, political parties, etc. However, universal utilitarianism is believed to be the pure form of utilitarianism. It maximizes the good to be extended to all humankind without any discrimination. There's no excluded number of people in this form. It is said that everyone is to count for one and no one for more than one. Now, let's move on to the wider scope when it comes to theological theory in Module 2. Here, theological theory said that the theological ethical system postulates that no one can determine whether an act is intrinsically right or wrong by simply analyzing the nature of the act. It means it implies that the basis for knowing what is right or wrong solely depends on the consequences of the act. Again, the visibility of the consequences is a must for us to know if the act is right or wrong. The maximization of good more than other act is not enough for us to say something is right or wrong. Here, quantitative and qualitative hedonism.
May oras pa. One last coffee? Alam mo, mamimiss mo to, Kath. So, sarap naman dito.
Yung kape, oo. Milkier kasi.
So, yung kape lang ba talaga mamimiss mo? Kath.
Ano? Ako na lang ata hinihintay.
I love you.
A cup in hand, you know it's worth your while.
Okay na to, sir? Hindi pa.
A cup in hand, can you just stay for a while? It all starts
Mas masarap nga dito.
with an Nescafe.
Basic disagreement among theologians concern the nature of the intrinsic good that is to be maximized or promoted. Quantitative and qualitative hedonism believe that there is only one intrinsic good and that they are monists. Here, an example will be quantitative hedonist is Jeremy Bentham, which is for him, good is equal to bodily pleasure. While for John Stuart Mill, it's an example of qualitative hedonist. That means good is equal to intellectual pleasure. The beneficiary of the good states again, the egoism is directed to self-interest and utilitarian is for the greatest number of people. Since we are talking about good here, it is linked to what we call pleasure from the previous slide. And as ancient Greek, Cyrenaic, and Epicurus have a word about it. And it leads us to know the absence of pain in mind, which is the highest pleasure that should be sought after. Here it is said too that our life must be perceived as a whole and not from the point of view of the present time alone. Now to continue Module 2, here's my buddy, Bea Mendoza.
Utility is the measure of the potential of an action or an object to produce happiness or to prevent the occurrence of pain. According to Bentham, a modern exponent of limited utilitarianism, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, which alone point out what we ought to do and determine what we shall do. This philosophy traces its roots back to David Hume, who argued that utility forms the foundation of ethics and justice. Bentham operationalized these ideas into the principle of utility, which divides the extent and limits of his system based on pleasure and pain. Bentham was also the one who invented hedonistic calculus, with the end view of helping us calculate the quantity of pleasure over that of pain. When in doubt about the value of pleasure or pain, Bentham suggests that considering criteria such as intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, propinquity, or remoteness. Moreover, the hedonistic calculus includes three additional criteria when in doubt regarding the value of pleasure or pain in estimating the tendency of an act by which it is produced. The first one is fecundity, which refers to the possibility that pleasure will be followed by another of the same kind. Purity, considering the possibility that pleasure will be followed by its opposite or pain. And extent, which quantifies the number of people affected by the act. Now, let's delve deeper into utilitarianism, the most influential moral philosophy of the last 2 centuries. Jeremy Bentham is acknowledged as the founder of utilitarianism. In the face of moral dilemmas, Bentham proposes a pragmatic approach. Measure the gains and losses of alternatives in terms of the balance of pleasure over pain. The alternative producing the greatest balance of pleasure or the smallest balance of pain is deemed the right action or moral obligation, that is, this is what you ought to do. Bentham's hedonistic calculus can be applied by anyone to quantitatively measure the amount of pleasure over pain in any specific moral situation. John Stuart Mill, the most famous utilitarian, laid the foundation of his moral philosophy by stating categorically positing that the ultimate good or summum bonum. All moral actions should be aimed at attaining this good, which Mill insists as happiness. According to the greatest happiness principle, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness, he meant pleasure and the absence of pain, and by unhappiness, he meant pain and the lack of pleasure. Mill diverges from Bentham on two crucial points, giving rise to qualitative hedonism. He rejects the purely quantitative treatment of utility, arguing that some pleasures are intrinsically superior to others. Mill cites Epicurus, emphasizing that the good life involves not only bodily pleasure, but also higher forms like intellectual and spiritual pleasure. This introduces the criterion for judging the quality of pleasure, which is the judge must experience both kinds of pleasure. As an example, Mill introduced Socrates, who is acquainted with both bodily and intellectual pleasures. If you ask Socrates which pleasure is more desirable, Socrates will choose intellectual pleasure. Mill's proof of the principle of utility rests on the idea that the only evidence for something being desirable is people desiring it. Solomon's generous interpretation of Mill's proof asserts that individual happiness is the only thing desired by each person, making general happiness the only thing desired for itself by all. This leads to the conclusion that the rightness or wrongness of actions is determined by its tendency to promote general happiness. Then we have non-hedonistic utilitarianism. Non-hedonism implies the broadest category of the pluralistic definition of good, where the right action is one that, to the best of the agent's knowledge, produces the greatest amount of good as a whole. Hastings-Rashdall introduced the concept of ideal utilitarianism, suggesting that actions are right or wrong based on their contribution to an ideal end or good, extending beyond pleasure.
Ito na.
Hi. Bal? Sa dinami-dami, ba't ako?
Ewan.
Di nga.
Kath, parang kape lang. May creamy, pero iba ang milky creamy coffee. Sa akin, there's only one.
A cup in hand, you know it's worth your while.
Ikaw, ba't ako?
Parang ito. Mas sumasarap habang tumatagal.
It all starts with the Nescafe.
Within utilitarianism, there are act-utilitarians, including Epicurus, Bentham, Mill, and Rashdal, who focus on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain at the level of individual acts. Conversely, there are rule utilitarians that extend the principle of utility to general rules rather than specific acts. They consider what rules, if universally followed, would maximize overall good in the world. To illustrate the difference between the two, consider the example of cheating in an exam. An act utilitarian would calculate the balance of pleasure and pain for this specific act, justifying it if the pleasure maximized outweighs the pain minimized. On the other hand, a rule utilitarian would evaluate the act against the rule of intellectual honesty, deeming it morally wrong if it violates the established rule, regardless of the consequences.
That's all. Thank you for listening.